Oberleutnant Armin Faber was a 24-year-old German Luftwaffe pilot serving as the administrative adjutant to the commander of the 3rd Group of Jagdgeschwader II, one of the German Air Force's premier fighter wings based at Morlaix Airfield in Brittany on the northwestern coast of occupied France in June 1942. The administrative duties of a group adjutant normally kept Faber busy with paperwork, personnel management, and coordination tasks that left little time for actual combat flying, which frustrated him because he had trained as a fighter pilot and wanted to engage the enemy rather than pushing papers at a desk, while his squadron mates fought daily battles against RAF fighters and bombers over the English Channel. On the morning of June 23, 1942, Faber received special permission from his commander to fly a combat mission with the 7th Staffel, a frontline squadron equipped with the Focke-Wulf 190A3, the Luftwaffe's newest and most advanced fighter aircraft that had only recently arrived at frontline units and was already causing severe problems for the Royal Air Force. The Focke-Wulf 190 represented a quantum leap in German fighter technology, superior in almost every performance metric to the RAF's frontline Spitfire Mark 50 fighters that had dominated the skies during the Battle of Britain but were now outclassed by the new German design that combined exceptional speed, climb rate, armament and maneuverability into a package that terrified British pilots who encountered it. The FW-190A3 that Faber would fly that day was powered by a BMW 801D2 radial engine producing 1,700 horsepower, giving the aircraft a maximum speed exceeding 400 miles per hour at altitude and a rate of climb that allowed it to reach 20,000 feet in under 7 minutes. The fighter was armed with two 7.92mm machine guns in the engine cowling, two 20mm cannons in the wing roots, and two more 20mm cannons in the outer wings, providing devastating firepower that could destroy enemy aircraft with just a few hits. The wide-track landing gear made ground handling safe and easy, the spacious cockpit provided excellent visibility, and the overall design philosophy emphasized pilot comfort and operational effectiveness in ways that British and American fighters of the period did not match. The mission on June 23 was a response to a British bombing raid targeting industrial facilities in northern France, with RAF Boston light bombers making a daylight attack escorted by numerous Spitfire fighters whose job was to protect the bombers from German interceptors and engage any Luftwaffe fighters that attempted to break through the escort screen. The Germans scrambled multiple fighter squadrons to intercept the raid, and a massive dogfight developed over the English Channel as British and German fighters maneuvered for advantage while the Boston bombers pressed on toward their targets through intense anti-aircraft fire from German coastal batteries. Faber took off from Morlaix with his squadron in the late morning, climbing rapidly to intercept altitude while scanning the sky for British aircraft that intelligence reports indicated would be approaching from the northwest. The formation spotted the British bombers and their escort of Spitfires, and the Germans dove to attack, initiating a confused melee where dozens of aircraft twisted and turned at high speeds, while pilots tried to get firing solutions on enemies while avoiding being shot themselves. The FW-190's superior performance gave the German pilots a significant advantage, and they quickly began scoring victories against the Spitfires, whose pilots found themselves unable to escape or outmaneuver the faster and more agile German fighters. The engagement resulted in a lopsided German victory, with 7 Spitfires shot down compared to only 2 FW-190s lost, a kill ratio that demonstrated the technological superiority the Focke-Wulf enjoyed over the aging Spitfire Mark 5. One of the downed Spitfires was flown by Czech pilot Alois Vashatko, who died when his aircraft collided head-on with a German fighter during the chaotic combat, the impact destroying both planes and killing Vashatko instantly, while the German pilot managed to bail out and was rescued from the channel by German naval forces. The surviving Spitfires eventually disengaged and fled back toward England, while the German fighters claimed victory and began the return flight to their bases in France. During the battle, Faber engaged multiple Spitfires and found himself being pursued by Sergeant František Treitner of 310 Squadron, a determined Czech pilot who stayed on Faber's tail through a series of violent maneuvers as both aircraft twisted through the sky at speeds exceeding 350 miles per hour. Faber used his superior aircraft performance and his own considerable skill to try shaking off the pursuing Spitfire. But Traitner was an experienced pilot who anticipated Faber's moves and maintained his firing position despite the Germans' best efforts to escape. The chase continued north over Devon in southern England as Faber flew at low altitude, trying to use terrain features to break the pursuit. After several minutes of high-speed maneuvering, with Traitner still pursuing, Faber pulled a desperate Immelmann turn, a vertical climbing maneuver where the aircraft goes straight up, rolls inverted at the top, and comes down facing the opposite direction, placing Faber in a head-on attack position against Traitner's Spitfire that was still climbing to follow. The two fighters raced toward each other at a combined closing speed exceeding 600 miles per hour, with both pilots firing their guns in the brief seconds before they would either score a hit or flash past each other. Faber's cannon shells struck Traitner's Spitfire, causing critical damage that set the engine on fire and forced the Czech pilot to bail out, though not before sustaining shrapnel wounds to his arm and injuries during the parachute landing that left him with a broken leg. Faber watched Traitner's parachute deploy and felt the satisfaction of a confirmed kill, his first victory in the FW-190 after weeks of administrative duties that had kept him out of combat. But the prolonged chase and the intense maneuvering had completely disoriented him regarding his position and heading, a common problem during dogfights where pilots focused entirely on the enemy aircraft and lost track of navigation references while pulling high G turns that affected spatial awareness and geographical orientation. When Faber looked around to establish his position after shooting down Traitner, he saw water below and coastline in the distance, which he interpreted as the English Channel with the French coast visible ahead. The critical error Faber made was misidentifying the Bristol Channel, which separates southern Wales from southwestern England, as the English Channel that separates England from France. The two bodies of water look similar from altitude, both being relatively narrow channels of water bordered by coastlines on both sides, and a disoriented pilot who had lost track of his position during combat could easily confuse them, especially given the stress of combat and the adrenaline affecting clear thinking. Faber also mistook north for south, believing he was flying south toward France when he was actually flying north toward Wales, a navigation error that would prove catastrophic. The disorientation was understandable given the circumstances, with Faber having flown north during the chase with Traitner, then reversed course during the Immelmann turn, creating confusion about which direction was which. When combined with the similar appearance of the two channels and the lack of clear landmarks that Faber could use for positive identification. Modern aircraft have sophisticated navigation equipment including GPS that makes such errors nearly impossible, but in 1942 pilots relied on visual navigation, dead reckoning, and instruments that showed heading and speed but not absolute position, meaning that a pilot who lost track of his position during combat had to rely on visual identification of terrain features to re-establish where he was. Faber saw the coastline ahead and believed it was France, so he headed toward what he thought was his home base, relieved to be returning after a successful combat mission where he had shot down an enemy fighter and survived an intense dogfight. As he approached the coast of Wales, which he believed was France, he spotted an airfield that he assumed was a German base, probably his own at Morlaix or another Luftwaffe field in Brittany. The airfield was actually RAF Pembrey in South Wales, a training facility for the RAF's air gunnery school where student air gunners practiced their skills on range aircraft, not an active combat base with fighter squadrons prepared to intercept German aircraft. The sight of the airfield below triggered Faber's excitement about his successful mission, and following fighter pilot tradition of celebrating victories, he decided to perform a victory roll before landing, a maneuver where the aircraft flies over the field inverted in a celebratory display that announces the pilot's combat success to everyone on the ground. Faber rolled his FW-190 inverted and flew past the airfield upside down, waggling his wings in triumph, completely unaware that the people watching from below were British personnel who could see the unmistakable German markings on his aircraft and couldn't believe what they were witnessing. The British ground crew and other personnel at RAF Pembrey watched in astonishment as a German fighter performed aerobatics over their airfield, initially thinking it might be a captured German plane being flown by British test pilots, but the victory roll suggested the pilot thought he was at a friendly field. Flight Sergeant Jeffries, the duty pilot responsible for managing aircraft movements at Pembrey that day, realized immediately that this was a German pilot who had made a catastrophic navigation error and was about to land at an enemy airfield thinking it was home. Jeffries grabbed the only weapon within immediate reach, a flare pistol normally used for signaling, and ran toward the runway where the German fighter was beginning its landing approach. Faber lowered his landing gear and flaps, configuring the FW-190 for landing while looking for familiar landmarks around what he thought was his home field. The absence of recognition didn't trigger alarm because Faber had only recently transferred to Morlex and wasn't deeply familiar with the area, and airfields generally look similar from the air with their runways, hangars, and support buildings arranged in patterns that vary but share common features. The smooth landing Faber executed demonstrated his piloting skill, with the FW-190 touching down gently and rolling out along the runway, while Faber looked for parking areas where ground crew would direct him to shut down. The moment the FW-190's wheels touched British soil, Jeffries sprinted toward the aircraft with his flare pistol held like a weapon, determined to capture the German pilot before he realized his mistake and attempted to take off again. Other British personnel emerged from buildings and approached the aircraft, some carrying rifles or other weapons, creating a scene where armed men surrounded the taxiing fighter while the pilot inside remained oblivious to his situation. Faber slowed his aircraft and looked around for the familiar faces of his ground crew, expecting to see German mechanics ready to help him shut down and park, but instead seeing British uniforms and raised weapons. Jeffries jumped onto the FW-190's wing as Faber brought the aircraft to a stop, pointing the flare pistol through the cockpit canopy at the German pilot's head while shouting for him to shut down the engine and surrender. The realization of what had happened struck Faber like a physical blow as he saw British faces, British uniforms, and weapons aimed at him, understanding in a horrifying instant that he had made an unthinkable navigation error and landed at an enemy airfield, delivering Germany's most advanced fighter aircraft directly into British hands. The magnitude of the mistake was so devastating that Faber later attempted suicide, so despondent about his failure that he preferred death to living with the knowledge that he had single-handedly given the enemy a technological prize of incalculable value. The British personnel secured Faber and prevented his suicide attempt, placing him under guard while they contacted higher headquarters to report the incredible event that had just occurred. Group Captain David Atcherley was assigned to escort Faber to RAF Fairwood Common for interrogation, and during the car journey, Atcherley kept his revolver aimed at the German pilot, fearing an escape attempt despite Faber's obvious depression. At one point, the car hit a pothole that jolted Atcherley's hand, causing the revolver to fire accidentally, with the bullet narrowly missing Faber's head, a near-fatal accident that would have been grimly ironic given that Faber had just survived combat only to nearly die in a traffic accident. The interrogation of Faber revealed the details of his navigation error and confirmed that he genuinely believed he was landing in France rather than engaging in some deliberate defection or elaborate ruse. The Germans had issued strict orders prohibiting FW-190 pilots from flying over Britain, specifically to prevent the possibility of a downed aircraft providing the British with access to the new fighter's technology, and the irony that Faber had personally delivered written copies of these orders from Luftwaffe Chief Hermann Göring just days before his own catastrophic mistake added to the humiliation of the situation. Faber's capture and the seizure of his aircraft represented one of the most valuable intelligence coups of the entire war for British aviation. The Royal Air Force had been desperately seeking to acquire an intact FW-190 for testing and evaluation ever since the type first appeared over France in August 1941 and began shooting down Spitfires with disturbing regularity. British intelligence had even planned elaborate schemes to steal an FW-190, including proposals to send German-speaking RAF pilots into France wearing Luftwaffe uniforms to land at German airfields, claim aircraft malfunctions, and fly out in FW-190s before anyone realized the deception. These plans were considered highly risky and unlikely to succeed, making Faber's accidental delivery of an undamaged aircraft an incredible gift that eliminated all the risk and difficulty the British would have faced attempting to acquire one through covert operations. The FW-190A3, that Faber delivered was immediately secured and transported to the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough, where British test pilots and engineers could examine it in detail. Group Captain Hugh Wilson, the RAF's leading test pilot for captured enemy aircraft, was asked to fly the German fighter from Pembrey to Farnborough, but the request came with an impossible guarantee that he wouldn't crash it. Unable to provide such a guarantee, given the inherent risks of test flying an unfamiliar aircraft, Wilson arranged for the FW-190 to be disassembled and transported by truck to avoid any possibility of losing the irreplaceable aircraft in a flying accident. At Farnborough, British engineers and pilots spent the next several weeks conducting exhaustive tests on the FW-190, measuring its performance, examining its construction, analysing its systems, and flying it in mock combat against British fighters to determine its strengths and weaknesses. The aircraft was repainted in RAF colours and given the British serial number MP499, along with a P for prototype designation, then flown extensively by test pilots who compared it directly against the Spitfire Mark V and the newer Spitfire Mark IX that was just entering service. The testing began on July 3, 1942, just 10 days after Faber's mistaken landing, and accumulated approximately 9 flying hours during the initial evaluation at Farnborough. The test results confirmed what British pilots had been reporting from combat. The FW-190 was superior to the Spitfire Mark V in almost every metric, except turning radius at low speeds. The German fighter was faster, climbed better, rolled faster, dove better, and could maintain its performance across a wider range of altitudes and speeds than the British aircraft. However, the testing also revealed a critical weakness. The FW-190's performance degraded significantly at altitudes above 20,000 feet, where the air became too thin for its mechanically supercharged radial engine to maintain power, while the Spitfire's Merlin engine, with its 2-stage supercharger, continued performing well at high altitudes. This discovery provided RAF Fighter Command with a tactical solution to the FW-190 problem. British pilots could force engagements at high altitudes where their Spitfires retained superior performance, negating the German fighters' advantages at medium and low altitudes. The tactical guidance was quickly disseminated to frontline squadrons, along with detailed briefings on the FW-190's capabilities and limitations, allowing British pilots to develop effective counter-tactics that exploited the weaknesses Faber's aircraft had revealed. The impact on combat effectiveness was immediate and significant, with RAF losses decreasing as pilots learned how to fight the FW-190 successfully rather than being consistently outmatched. After the Farnborough evaluation, Faber's FW-190 was transferred to the Air Fighting Development Unit at RAF Duxford, where it was used for tactical trials against various British fighters, including direct comparison flights against the new Spitfire Mark IX that was specifically designed to counter the FW-190 threat. These trials provided valuable data that helped RAF pilots understand how to maximize their own aircraft strengths while exploiting German weaknesses, contributing to the gradual shift in aerial combat over Europe from German dominance in 1941, early 1942, to increasing Allied air superiority from late 1942 onward. Some features of the FW-190's design influenced subsequent British fighter development, with engineers studying the German aircraft's wide-track landing gear, spacious cockpit, and robust construction to identify improvements that could be incorporated into future British designs. The intelligence gained from examining Faber's aircraft extended beyond pure performance data to include manufacturing techniques, material choices, and design philosophies that revealed German aviation industry capabilities and helped Allied intelligence assess German technological development more broadly. Faber spent the remainder of the war as a prisoner of war, eventually being sent to a POW camp in Canada, where he was held with other captured German military personnel under conditions that generally complied with Geneva Convention protocols regarding treatment of prisoners. The psychological burden of his mistake haunted Faber throughout his captivity, with fellow prisoners aware of his role in delivering a priceless intelligence asset to the enemy through a navigation error so basic it seemed almost impossible for a trained pilot to make. The shame and depression Faber experienced were severe enough that camp authorities monitored him carefully to prevent further suicide attempts. The propaganda value of Faber's mistake was exploited by both sides, with the British publicizing the capture of an advanced German fighter as evidence of superior RAF capabilities and German pilot incompetence, while the German propaganda machine worked to minimize the incident's significance and blamed Faber's error on equipment malfunctions rather than pilot failure. The truth was that Faber made a comprehensible error under combat stress that any pilot might have made given the same circumstances of disorientation, similar-looking terrain features, and the adrenaline-fueled confusion following intense combat. But the consequences were so severe that the mistake became legendary within aviation circles. The war ended in May 1945 with Germany's unconditional surrender, and Faber was eventually repatriated to Germany, where he attempted to rebuild his life in a country devastated by years of war and Allied bombing. The post-war years were difficult for many former Luftwaffe personnel who faced suspicion, poverty, and the psychological challenges of adjusting to civilian life after years of military service, and Faber's particular burden of being known as the pilot who delivered an FW-190 to the enemy made his reintegration especially challenging. Details of his post-war life are limited, but he eventually settled into civilian employment and lived quietly, rarely discussing his wartime experiences. In 1991, nearly 50 years after his fateful mistake, an elderly Armin Faber visited the Shoreham Aircraft Museum in England, which had acquired artifacts from his FW-190, including the armored glass windscreen and parts of the control panel. In a gesture of reconciliation and perhaps closure, Faber donated his officer's dagger and pilot's badge to the museum, physical symbols of his service that he chose to place in the institution that preserved the memory of his most significant contribution to aviation history. However unintentional that contribution had been, the visit represented a kind of peace with the past, acknowledging the incident while honoring the historical significance of the aircraft and the role it played in Allied victory. The FW-190A3 that Faber accidentally delivered to the British no longer exists in complete form, having been eventually scrapped after its usefulness for testing and evaluation ended, though components and artifacts survive in various museums as physical reminders of one of World War II's most consequential mistakes. The impact of Faber's error on the air war over Europe is difficult to quantify precisely, but RAF historians and pilots have consistently credited the intelligence gained from testing his aircraft with saving numerous British lives by providing the tactical and technical knowledge needed to fight the FW-190 effectively during the critical period of 1942-1943, when German air superiority threatened to undermine Allied strategic bombing campaigns and cross-channel operations. The lessons from Faber's mistake extended beyond the immediate intelligence value to broader implications for aviation operations, navigation procedures, and combat doctrine. The incident highlighted the vulnerability of even experienced pilots to disorientation during high-stress combat, leading to improved training in navigation and situational awareness that emphasized constant position verification and the use of multiple navigation methods to reduce the risk of catastrophic errors. Military aviation organizations on both sides studied the incident and implemented procedural changes designed to prevent similar mistakes, though the fundamental challenge of maintaining orientation during combat remains a concern even with modern technology. The human dimension of Faber's story involves a young pilot who made a split-second error with consequences that extended far beyond his individual fate, affecting the course of the air war and potentially influencing the broader outcome of World War II through the intelligence windfall his mistake provided to the Allied cause. The incident raises questions about responsibility, fate, and the role of individual actions in determining historical outcomes, with Faber's navigation error arguably saving British lives that would have been lost if RAF pilots had continued fighting the FW-190 without understanding its weaknesses and limitations. Armin Faber died in Germany at an unknown date in the post-war period, having lived with the knowledge of his mistake for the rest of his life. The exact circumstances and date of his death are not well documented, reflecting his retreat from public attention and his desire to live quietly after the war, rather than being defined solely by his most famous moment. His legacy is complex and paradoxical. A competent pilot who achieved aerial victory in combat, but is remembered primarily for his catastrophic navigation error. A German officer who inadvertently contributed significantly to Allied victory through his mistake, and a human being who experienced the shame and depression of knowing that his error had major historical consequences. The story of Armin Faber and his accidental landing at RAF Pembrey remains one of the most extraordinary incidents of World War II aviation history, a tale that combines combat action, human error, technological intelligence, and historical consequence in ways that continue fascinating historians and aviation enthusiasts decades after the event. The incident stands as a reminder that warfare, despite all its planning and technology and strategy, ultimately depends on human beings making decisions under pressure, and that individual mistakes can sometimes alter the course of history in ways no one could have anticipated when the error was made. The technical specifications of the Focke-Wulf 190A3 that Faber delivered revealed design philosophies that differed significantly from Allied approaches to fighter development, with German engineers prioritizing pilot ergonomics and maintenance accessibility in ways that British and American designs often sacrificed for other priorities. The wide-track landing gear that made ground handling safer and easier reflected German experience from the pre-war period when narrow-track fighters like the Messerschmitt Bf 109 had high accident rates during takeoffs and landings, killing or injuring pilots in operational accidents that reduced effective strength without enemy action. The spacious cockpit with excellent visibility gave German pilots advantages in spotting threats and maintaining situational awareness during the chaotic conditions of air combat, where seeing the enemy first often determined who survived the engagement. The armament layout of 4 20mm cannons plus 2 machine guns provided devastating firepower that could destroy enemy aircraft with brief bursts, reducing the time German pilots needed to hold their aim on target and lowering the risk of being hit while maneuvering for a shot. British fighters of the period typically carried 8 303 caliber machine guns, whose lighter projectiles required longer firing times to inflict damage, placing British pilots at disadvantage when fighting German aircraft that could kill with a single well-aimed burst. The FW-190's ammunition capacity gave it endurance for extended combat missions without the need to carefully conserve ammunition, while Spitfire pilots had to manage their limited ammunition supplies carefully to ensure they could defend themselves throughout entire missions. The evaluation of Faber's FW-190 at Farnborough employed the same rigorous testing protocols the RAF applied to all captured enemy aircraft, with test pilots flying specific maneuvers while engineers recorded performance data using instruments that measured speed, altitude, climb rate, acceleration, and other metrics that characterized the aircraft's capabilities. The direct comparison flights against Spitfires were particularly valuable because they provided objective measurements of relative performance rather than pilot subjective impressions that might be influenced by expectations or biases. British test pilots flew both aircraft under identical conditions, comparing how quickly each could climb to specific altitudes, what speeds each could achieve in level flight and dives, how tightly each could turn, and how responsive each was to control inputs during aerobatic maneuvers. The weaknesses discovered during testing included not just the high-altitude performance degradation, but also specific handling characteristics that British pilots could exploit, such as the FW-190's tendency to roll when pulling hard turns at certain speeds, requiring German pilots to compensate with opposite aileron input that slowed their turn rate and created brief windows where British pilots could gain advantage. The radial engine's sensitivity to sustained high-power settings meant German pilots had to carefully manage engine temperatures during combat, while the Spitfire's liquid-cooled Merlin engine could maintain full power longer without overheating risks. These seemingly minor differences became tactically significant when British pilots understood them and could structure engagements to exploit them. The intelligence briefings prepared from the FW-190 testing reached frontline squadrons through secure channels that ensured the information helped British pilots without revealing to the Germans how much the British had learned from Faber's aircraft. The briefings included specific tactical recommendations: force engagements above 20,000 feet, where Spitfires retained advantage; use vertical maneuvers, where the Spitfire's lighter wing loading gave it better sustained climb rate; avoid head-on attacks, where the FW-190's superior armament created lethal danger, and exploit the FW-190's slower roll rate at high speeds by using rolling scissors maneuvers that forced German pilots to react to rapid direction changes they couldn't match. The impact of this intelligence on combat outcomes became evident within weeks, as British pilots reported greater success fighting FW-190s using the recommended tactics, and German pilots noticed that British tactics had changed in ways that neutralized the FW-190's previous dominance. The Luftwaffe couldn't understand why British performance suddenly improved until German intelligence pieced together reports about the missing FW-190 and Faber's capture. Realizing that the British had gained comprehensive knowledge of their aircraft's capabilities and limitations through examining an intact example, the German response included attempts to modify tactics and introduce improved FW-190 variants with better high-altitude performance. But the fundamental advantages the British gained from testing Faber's aircraft persisted throughout the war. The broader strategic impact of Faber's mistake extended to the planning for Operation Overlord, the Allied invasion of Normandy in June 1944, which required air superiority over the invasion beaches to protect vulnerable landing craft and troops from German air attack. The improved British understanding of how to fight German fighters contributed to Allied success in gaining and maintaining air superiority during the critical D-Day period, with German aircraft unable to significantly interfere with landing operations because Allied fighters controlled the airspace using tactics partially derived from intelligence gained through testing captured German aircraft, including Faber's FW-190. Faber's experience as a prisoner of war followed the typical pattern for captured Luftwaffe officers, beginning with interrogation designed to extract tactical and technical information before transfer to permanent POW camps where he would spend the remainder of the war. The Canadian camps that housed German POWs were generally well administered and complied with international conventions regarding prisoner treatment, providing adequate food, shelter, medical care, and opportunities for recreation and education that made captivity tolerable, if not pleasant. The psychological impact of captivity varied among prisoners, with some adapting relatively well, while others suffered depression and anxiety that required medical intervention. The social dynamics within POW camps involved complex hierarchies based on rank, service branch, political affiliations, and personality factors that created tensions and conflicts among prisoners who had limited outlets for their energies and frustrations. Faber's status as the pilot who delivered an FW-190 to the enemy made him a figure of interest and sometimes scorn among fellow prisoners, though the detailed circumstances of his mistake were known only to those with access to intelligence briefings, and most prisoners knew only that he had been captured after a navigation error without understanding the full significance of what he had inadvertently given the British. The camp routine involved daily roll calls, work details for those required to labor under Geneva Convention provisions, educational classes organized by prisoners with relevant expertise, theatrical productions and sports competitions that provided entertainment and morale support, and the constant underlying tension of captivity with its boredom, homesickness, and uncertainty about when or whether prisoners would ever return home. Letters from family in Germany took months to arrive and were heavily censored by both German and Allied authorities, making communication with loved ones frustrating and incomplete, while news of Germany's deteriorating military situation filtered into camps through clandestine radio receivers and new prisoners arriving from frontline captures. The end of the war in May 1945 brought mixed emotions for German POWs, who were relieved that fighting had ceased, but uncertain about what awaited them in defeated Germany, where Allied occupation authorities would determine their fate. The repatriation process was slow and bureaucratic, with prisoners held for months in camps, while authorities verified identities, screened for war criminals, and arranged transportation back to Germany, where infrastructure destruction made movement difficult and housing shortages made resettlement challenging. Faber's return to Germany meant confronting a country physically devastated by Allied bombing, politically reorganized under occupation authorities, economically ruined by war's costs, and socially traumatized by military defeat and the revelations of Nazi atrocities that emerged during war crimes trials. The post-war German aviation community included many former Luftwaffe pilots who struggled to find civilian employment in a country where aviation industry had been destroyed by Allied bombing and prohibited from rebuilding under occupation agreements that sought to prevent German military resurgence. Some former pilots found work in related fields like automotive repair or mechanical engineering, while others retrained for completely different occupations, and a few eventually emigrated to countries where aviation opportunities existed for skilled pilots regardless of their wartime service. Faber's options were limited by his notoriety as the pilot whose mistake had aided Allied victory, making him unwelcome in aviation circles where his error was too famous to overlook. The psychological burden of living with major mistakes is a universal human experience that extends beyond military contexts. But Faber's error was magnified by its historical significance and the public knowledge of his role in events that affected thousands of lives. The coping mechanisms people develop for dealing with such burdens vary, with some finding ways to reframe the event in less damaging terms, others seeking forgiveness or redemption through subsequent actions, and some never fully recovering from the shame and regret that colors the rest of their lives. Faber's choice to visit the museum, displaying artifacts from his FW-190, and donate his personal military items suggests he eventually found some peace with what happened, accepting his place in history while honoring the significance of the aircraft and the men who fought on both sides. The preservation of historical artifacts like the FW-190 windscreen and control panel serves important functions beyond mere nostalgia, providing physical connections to past events that help people understand history in tangible ways that written accounts cannot fully convey. Museums that display wartime aircraft and equipment create spaces where visitors can contemplate the realities of aerial combat, the technologies that shaped outcomes, and the human stories of pilots who flew and sometimes died in these machines. The artifacts from Faber's FW-190 carry particular significance because of the aircraft's role in intelligence history and its connection to one of the war's most consequential mistakes. The study of military errors and their consequences is an important field within defense analysis, helping armed forces understand how mistakes occur and how to prevent them through improved training, better procedures, and technological solutions that reduce reliance on human judgment in critical situations. Faber's error falls into the category of navigation mistakes that remain possible despite technological advances, with modern military aviation still experiencing occasional incidents where pilots become disoriented and land at wrong airfields or in wrong countries, though the consequences are usually less severe than in Faber's case, because peacetime military aviation operates with safeguards and communications that weren't available during wartime combat operations. The comparison between Faber's mistake and other historical military errors reveals common patterns. Mistakes often occur during high-stress situations when cognitive load overwhelms decision-making capacity. Similar appearing situations create confusion that leads to misidentification. Fatigue and adrenaline impair judgment and perception, and cascading errors build on each other until the final consequence occurs. In Faber's case, the initial error of becoming disoriented during combat created the conditions for the subsequent error of misidentifying the Bristol Channel, which created conditions for the final error of landing at the wrong airfield, with each mistake making the next more likely. The role of luck in Faber's story cuts both ways. He was unlucky that his disorientation led him over Wales rather than actually taking him home to France, but he was also lucky that he survived the combat that caused the disorientation. Lucky that the British captured him rather than shooting him, and lucky that his post-war life allowed him enough years to eventually achieve some reconciliation with his past. The philosophical questions about fate, responsibility, and historical causation that the incident raises don't have clear answers, but they prompt reflection about how individual human actions shape larger historical outcomes in ways that no one can fully control or predict. The memory of Armin Faber persists primarily through his association with the FW-190 incident, rather than his other wartime experiences or his post-war life, demonstrating how single dramatic events can define a person's historical legacy regardless of everything else they did. The fairness of this reduction of a complex human life to one mistaken moment is debatable, but historical memory tends to emphasize dramatic incidents over gradual developments and exceptional events over routine experiences, making Faber's story the kind of anecdote that gets retold while the thousands of uneventful combat missions flown by forgotten pilots fade into obscurity. The final assessment of Faber's incident acknowledges both the genuine error he made and the understandable circumstances under which he made it, recognizing that judging historical actors requires consideration of the context they operated in rather than applying modern standards or hindsight knowledge they couldn't have possessed. Armin Faber was a skilled pilot who performed well in combat and made a navigation error that any pilot might have made under similar circumstances, but whose error had consequences far exceeding typical navigation mistakes because it occurred at a critical moment in the technological competition between Allied and Axis air forces. His story reminds us that history turns on human decisions and mistakes, that technology and strategy matter but ultimately depend on fallible human beings implementing them, and that individual actions can influence events in ways that extend far beyond the actor's intentions or control. The educational value of Faber's story extends to multiple disciplines beyond military history, providing case studies for fields ranging from psychology to engineering to decision science. Psychologists study the incident as an example of how stress affects cognitive function and spatial orientation, with Faber's disorientation during combat illustrating the limitations of human performance under extreme conditions. Engineers examine how technology can mitigate human error through better navigation systems, cockpit displays, and automated warnings that prevent pilots from making catastrophic mistakes, even when disoriented or confused. Decision scientists analyze the cascading nature of Faber's errors, showing how initial mistakes create conditions for subsequent errors in ways that compound until disaster occurs. The preservation of Faber's story in museums, books, documentaries, and educational materials ensures that future generations can learn from his experience, understanding both the specific historical context of World War II aerial combat and the universal lessons about human fallibility, the importance of navigation discipline, and the way individual actions can shape collective outcomes. The Shoreham Aircraft Museum's display of artifacts from Faber's FW-190 creates a physical space where visitors can contemplate these themes while seeing actual objects connected to the event, providing educational experiences more powerful than abstract discussions of navigation errors and intelligence coups. The modern RAF Pembrey site, now closed as a military airfield and converted to other uses, bears little resemblance to the facility where Faber landed in 1942, but historical markers and local knowledge preserve the memory of that extraordinary day, when a German fighter touched down and changed aviation history. The local community in South Wales maintains pride in the incident as a moment when their region contributed significantly to Allied victory, even though the contribution came through enemy error rather than friendly action. The preservation of local memory complements formal historical documentation, creating multiple layers of remembrance that ensure important events don't fade into obscurity. The technological legacy of capturing Faber's FW-190 influenced post-war aviation development in ways both direct and indirect, with engineers who examined the German fighter carrying lessons learned into their subsequent work on jet aircraft, guided missiles, and modern fighter designs that inherited concepts first observed in the FW-190's construction. The emphasis on pilot ergonomics that German designers pioneered became standard practice in post-war aviation, with spacious cockpits, good visibility, and comfortable seating recognized as essential features rather than luxuries. The wide-track landing gear concept that made the FW-190 safer to operate on the ground influenced landing gear design for generations of subsequent aircraft. The intelligence methodology demonstrated through the FW-190 evaluation established protocols for testing captured enemy equipment that militaries worldwide adopted and refined over subsequent decades. The systematic approach of measuring performance, comparing against friendly equipment, identifying strengths and weaknesses, developing counter-tactics, and disseminating findings to frontline units became standard practice for handling captured weapons and vehicles, whether aircraft, tanks, missiles, or electronic systems. The organizational structures and procedures developed at Farnborough for testing enemy aircraft evolved into permanent institutions that continue evaluating foreign military technology today. The human cost of the air war over Europe provides context for understanding why capturing an intact FW-1D-90 mattered so much. With RAF Bomber Command alone losing over 55,000 aircrew killed during the strategic bombing campaign against Germany, while German fighter forces suffered similarly devastating casualties defending their homeland. Every tactical advantage that reduced friendly losses or increased enemy losses had direct impact on whether young men lived or died in combat, making the intelligence gained from Faber's aircraft valuable in the most literal sense, because it helped save British lives that would have been lost without the improved tactics derived from understanding the FW-190's weaknesses. The ethical dimensions of celebrating Faber's mistake while acknowledging his personal suffering create tension between historical appreciation of beneficial outcomes and empathy for the individual whose error produced those outcomes. The incident benefited the Allied cause and likely saved British lives while destroying Faber's career and causing him profound psychological harm, raising questions about how to appropriately commemorate events where positive and negative consequences are inseparably linked. Museums and historical accounts typically resolve this by focusing on the aircraft and the intelligence rather than Faber's personal tragedy, a choice that may seem cold but reflects practical limitations on how much emotional complexity can be conveyed in public history presentations. The comparative study of similar incidents from other wars reveals that Faber's mistake, while dramatic, was not unique in kind, even if exceptional in consequence. Pilots landing at wrong airfields in enemy territory occurred with surprising frequency during both world wars and subsequent conflicts, though most such incidents involved less consequential aircraft, or occurred in circumstances where the intelligence value was minimal. The frequency of such mistakes, despite professional training and standard procedures, demonstrates the persistent vulnerability of human navigation to error under stress, a vulnerability that remains even with modern GPS and automated systems that can fail or be disabled. The story's resonance in popular culture beyond aviation enthusiast circles demonstrates how certain historical incidents capture public imagination through their dramatic elements and clear narrative structure, with Faber's victory roll over the enemy airfield, followed by his horrified realization providing a narrative arc that needs no embellishment to be compelling. The incident has been retold in countless books, articles, television programs, and now online videos, each retelling emphasizing different aspects, but maintaining the core elements that make the story memorable and meaningful. Armin Faber's legacy ultimately rests on a paradox. He is remembered not for his combat victories or his skills as a pilot, but for his most catastrophic mistake. Yet that mistake had more historical impact than the successes of thousands of competent pilots whose names are forgotten. The incident illustrates how historical memory preserves the exceptional and dramatic while forgetting the routine and ordinary, creating a record of the past that emphasizes moments of crisis, change, and consequence over the vast stretches of time when nothing remarkable occurred. Faber would likely have preferred being forgotten entirely rather than being remembered for his mistake. But history makes its own choices about what to preserve and what stories to tell to future generations seeking to understand how the present emerged from the past.